You ought to know that the purpose of Scripture is simply to teach true science in right practice. True science is knowledge of God, blessed, and exalted, and the other beings as they really are, and especially of noble beings, and knowledge of happiness and misery in the next life. Right practice consists in performing the acts which bring happiness and avoiding the acts which bring misery, and it is knowledge of these acts that is called practical science. They fall into two divisions: outward bodily acts, the science of these is called jurisprudence, and acts of the soul such as gratitude, patience and other moral attitudes which the law enjoins or forbids, the science of these is called asceticism or the sciences of the future life. To these Abu Hamid turned his attention in his book, as people had given up this sort of act, and become immersed in the other sort, and as this sort involves the greater fear of God, which is the cause of happiness, he called his book The Revival of the Sciences of Religion. But we have digressed from our subject, so let us return to it. We say, the purpose of Scripture is to teach true science in right practice, and teaching is of two classes, of concepts and of judgments, as the logicians have shown. Now the methods available to men of arriving at judgments are three: demonstrative, dialectical and rhetorical, and the methods of forming concepts are two: either conceiving the object itself or conceiving a symbol of it. But not everyone has the natural ability to take in demonstrations, or even dialectical arguments, let alone demonstrative arguments which are so hard to learn and need so much time, even for those who are qualified to learn them. Therefore, since it is the purpose of Scripture simply to teach everyone, Scripture has to contain every method of bringing about judgments of assent and every method of forming concepts. Now some of the methods of assent comprehend the majority of people, i.e. the occurrence of assent as a result of them is comprehensive. These are the rhetorical and the dialectical methods, and the rhetorical is more comprehensive than the dialectical. Another method is peculiar to a smaller number of people. This is the demonstrative. Therefore, since the primary purpose of Scripture is to take care of the majority, the prevailing methods of expression in religion are the common methods by which the majority comes to form concepts and judgments. These common methods in religion are of four classes. One of them occurs where the method is common, yet specialized in two respects, i.e. where it is certain in its concepts and judgments, in spite of being rhetorical or dialectical. These syllogisms are those whose premises, in spite of being based on accepted ideas or on opinions, are accidentally certain, and whose conclusions are accidentally to be taken in their direct meaning without symbolization. Scriptural texts of this class have no allegorical interpretations, and anyone who denies them or interprets them allegorically is an unbeliever. The second class occurs where the premises, in spite of being based on accepted ideas or on opinions, are certain, and where the conclusions are symbols for the things which it was intended to conclude. Texts of this class, i.e. their conclusions, admit of allegorical interpretation. The third is the reverse of this. It occurs where the conclusions are the very things which it was intended to conclude, while the premises are based on accepted ideas or on opinions without being accidentally certain. Texts of this class, also, i.e. their conclusions, do not admit of allegorical interpretation, but their premises may do so. The fourth class occurs where the premises are based on accepted ideas or opinions, without being accidentally certain, and where the conclusions are symbols for what it was intended to conclude. In these cases the duty of the elite is to interpret them allegorically, while the duty of the masses is to take them in their apparent meaning. In general, everything in these texts, which admits of allegorical interpretation, can only be understood by demonstration. The duty of the elite here is to apply such interpretation, while the duty of the masses is to take them in their apparent meaning in both respects, i.e. in concept and judgment, since their natural capacity does not allow more than that. But there may occur to students of Scripture allegorical interpretations due to the superiority of one of the common methods over another in bringing about assent, i.e. when the indication contained in the allegorical interpretation is more persuasive than the indication contained in the apparent meaning. Such interpretations are popular, and the making of them is possibly a duty for those whose powers of theoretical understanding have attained the dialectical level. To this sort belong some of the interpretations of the Ashurites and Mutazilites, though the Mutazilites are generally sounder in their statements. The masses, on the other hand, who are incapable of more than rhetorical arguments, have the duty of taking these texts in their apparent meaning, and they are not permitted to know such interpretations at all. Thus people in relation to Scripture fall into three classes. One class is those who are not people of interpretation at all. These are the rhetorical class. They are the overwhelming mass, for no man of sound intellect is exempted from this kind of assent. Another class is the people of dialectical interpretation. These are the dialecticians, either by nature alone or by nature and habit. Another class is the people of certain interpretation. These are the demonstrative class, by nature and training, i.e. in the art of philosophy. This interpretation ought not to be expressed to the dialectical class, let alone to the masses. When something of these allegorical interpretations is expressed to anyone unfit to receive them, especially demonstrative interpretations, because of their remoteness from common knowledge, both he who expresses it and he to whom it is expressed are led into unbelief. The reason for that, in the case of the latter, is that allegorical interpretation comprises two things: rejection of the apparent meaning and affirmation of the allegorical one, so that if the apparent meaning is rejected in the mind of someone who can only grasp apparent meanings, without the allegorical meaning being affirmed in his mind, the result is unbelief. If it, the text in question, concerns the principles of religion, allegorical interpretations, then, ought not to be expressed to the masses nor set down in rhetorical or dialectical books, i.e. books containing arguments of these two sorts, as was done by Abu Hamid. They should be expressed to this class, and with regard to an apparent text, when there is a doubt whether it is apparent to everyone and whether knowledge of its interpretation is impossible for them, they should be told that it is ambiguous and, its meaning, known by no one except God, and that the stop should be put here in the sentence of the Exalted, and no one knows the interpretation thereof except God. The same kind of answer should also be given to a question about abstruse matters, which there is no way for the masses to understand, just as the Exalted has answered in Isis, saying, "And they will ask you about the Spirit. Say, the Spirit is by the command of my Lord, you have been given only a little knowledge." As for the man who expresses these allegories to unqualified persons, he is an unbeliever on account of his summoning people to unbelief. This is contrary to the summons of the legislator, especially when they are false allegories concerning the principles of religion, as has happened in the case of a group of people of our time. For we have seen some of them thinking that they were being philosophic and that they perceived, with their remarkable wisdom, things which conflict with Scripture in every respect, i.e., in passages which do not admit of allegorical interpretation, and that it was obligatory to express these things to the masses. But by expressing those false beliefs to the masses they have been a cause of perdition to the masses and themselves, in this world and the next. The relation between the aim of these people and the aim of the legislator can be illustrated by a parable of a man who goes to a skillful doctor. This doctor's aim is to preserve the health and cure the diseases of all the people, by prescribing for them rules which can be commonly accepted, about the necessity of using the things which will preserve their health and cure their diseases, and avoiding the opposite things. He is unable to make them all doctors, because a doctor is one who knows by demonstrative methods the things which preserve health and cure disease. Now this man whom we have mentioned, goes out to the people and tells them, "These methods prescribed by this doctor for you are not right," and he sets out to discredit them, so that they are rejected by the people. Or he says, "They have allegorical interpretations, but the people neither understand these nor assent to them in practice." Well, do you think that people in this condition will do any of the things which are useful for preserving health and curing disease, or that this man who has persuaded them to reject what they formerly believed in will now be able to use those things with them, I mean for preserving health? No, he will be unable to use those things with them, nor will they use them, and so they will all perish. This is what will happen, if he expresses to them true allegories about those matters, because of their inability to understand them, let alone if he expresses to them false allegories, because this will lead them to think that there are no such things as health which ought to be preserved and disease which ought to be cured, let alone that there are things which preserve health and cure disease. It is the same when someone expresses allegories to the masses, and to those who are not qualified to understand them, in the sphere of Scripture. Thus he makes it appear false and turns people away from it, and he who turns people away from Scripture is an unbeliever. Indeed, this comparison is certain, not poetic as one might suppose. It presents a true analogy, in that the relation of the doctor to the health of bodies is the same as the relation of the legislator to the health of souls, i.e. the doctor is he who seeks to preserve the health of bodies when it exists and to restore it when it is lost, while the legislator is he who desires this end for the health of souls. This health is what is called fear of God. The precious book has told us to seek it by acts conformable to the law, in several verses. Thus the Exalted has said, "Fasting has been prescribed for you, as it was prescribed for those who were before you, perhaps you will fear God." Again the Exalted has said, "Their flesh and their blood shall not touch God, but your fear shall touch him." Prayer prevents immorality and transgression, and other verses to the same effect contained in the precious book. Through knowledge of Scripture and practice according to Scripture, the legislator aims solely at this health, and it is from this health that happiness in the future life follows, just as misery in the future life follows from its opposite. From this it will be clear to you that true allegories ought not to be set down in popular books, let alone false ones. The true allegory is the deposit which man was charged to hold and which he held, and from which all beings shied away, i.e. that which is mentioned in the words of the Exalted, "We offered the deposit to the heavens, the earth and the mountains," and so on to the end of the verse. It was due to allegorical interpretations, especially the false ones, and the supposition that such interpretations of Scripture ought to be expressed to everyone, that the sects of Islam arose, with the result that each one accused the others of unbelief or heresy. Thus the Mutazilites interpreted many verses and traditions allegorically, and expressed their interpretations to the masses, and the Ashurites did the same, although they used such interpretations less frequently. In consequence they threw people into hatred, mutual detestation and wars, tore the Scriptures to shreds, and completely divided people. In addition to all this, in the methods which they followed to establish their interpretations, they neither went along with the masses nor with the elite, not with the masses, because their methods were obscure, than the methods common to the majority, and not with the elite, because if these methods are inspected they are found deficient in the conditions required for demonstration, as will be understood after the slightest inspection by anyone acquainted with the conditions of demonstration. Further, many of the principles on which the Ashurites based their knowledge are sophistical, for they deny many necessary truths such as the permanence of accidents, the action of things on other things, the existence of necessary causes for effects, of substantial forms, and of secondary causes. And their theorists wrong the Muslims in this sense, that a sect of Ashurites called an unbeliever anyone who did not attain knowledge of the existence of the glorious Creator by the methods laid down by them in their books for attaining this knowledge. But in truth it is they who are the unbelievers and in error. From this point they proceeded to disagree, one group saying the primary obligation is theoretical study, another group saying it is belief, i.e., this happened because they did not know which are the methods common to everyone, through whose doors the law has summoned all people to enter. They supposed that there was only one method. Thus they mistook the aim of the legislator, and were both themselves in error and led others into error. It may be asked, if these methods followed by the Ashurites and other theorists are not the common methods by which the legislator has aimed to teach the masses, and by which alone it is possible to teach them, then what are those common methods in this religion of ours? We reply, they are exclusively the methods set down in the precious book. For if the precious book is inspected, there will be found in it the three methods that are available for all the people, the common methods for the instruction of the majority of the people and the special method. And if their merits are inspected, it becomes apparent that no better common methods for the instruction of the masses can be found than the methods mentioned in it. Thus whoever tampers with them, by making an allegorical interpretation not apparent in itself, or, at least, not more apparent to everyone than they are, is rejecting their wisdom and rejecting their intended effects in procuring human happiness. This is very apparent from a comparison of the condition of the first believers with the condition of those who came after them. For the first believers arrived at perfect virtue and fear of God only by using these sayings of Scripture, without interpreting them allegorically, and any one of them who did find out an allegorical interpretation did not think fit to express it to others. But when those who came after them used allegorical interpretation, their fear of God grew less, their dissensions increased, their love for one another was removed, and they became divided into sects. So whoever wishes to remove this heresy from religion should direct his attention to the precious book, and glean from it the indications present in it, concerning everything in turn that it obliges us to believe. Errand exercise his judgment in looking at its apparent meaning as well as he is able, without interpreting any of it allegorically, except where the allegorical meaning is apparent in itself, i.e. commonly apparent to everyone. For if the sayings set down in Scripture for the instruction of the people are inspected, it seems that in mastering their meaning one arrives at a point, beyond which none but a man of the demonstrative class can extract from their apparent wording a meaning which is not apparent in them. This property is not found in any other sayings. For those religious sayings in the precious book which are expressed to everyone have three properties that indicate their miraculous character. There exists none more completely persuasive and convincing to everyone than they. Their meaning admits naturally of mastery, up to a point beyond which their allegorical interpretation can only be found out by the demonstrative class. They contain means of drawing the attention of the people of truth to the true allegorical meaning. This character is not found in the doctrines of the Ashurites nor in those of the Mutazilites, i.e. their interpretations do not admit of mastery nor contain means of drawing attention to the truth, nor are they true, and this is why heresies have multiplied. It is our desire to devote our time to this object and achieve it effectively, and if God grants us a respite of life we shall work steadily towards it insofar as this is made possible for us, and it may be that that work will serve as a starting point for our successors. For our soul is in the utmost sorrow and pain by reason of the evil fancies and perverted beliefs which have infiltrated this religion, and particularly such afflictions as have happened to it at the hands of people who claim an affinity with philosophy. For injuries from a friend are more severe than injuries from an enemy. I refer to the fact that philosophy is the friend and milk sister of religion. Thus injuries from people related to philosophy are the severest injuries to religion, apart from the enmity, hatred and quarrels which such injuries stir up between the two, which are companions by nature and lovers by essence and instinct. It has also been injured by a host of ignorant friends who claim an affinity with it. These are the sects which exist within it. But God directs all men aright and helps everyone to love him. He unites their hearts in the fear of him, and removes from them hatred and loathing by his grace and his mercy. Indeed, God has already removed many of these ills, ignorant ideas and misleading practices, by means of this triumphant rule. By it he has opened a way to many benefits, especially to the class of persons who have trodden the path of study and sought to know the truth. This, he has done, by summoning the masses to a middle way of knowing God the glorious, a way which is raised above the low level of the followers of authority but is below the turbulence of the theologians, and by drawing the attention of the elite to their obligation to make a thorough study of the principles of religion. God is the giver of success and the guide by his goodness.